ladies and gentlemen, inside and outside the Innovate Island network, thank you very much for joining us. A reminder to all, Charlie does this very well. What are we, Charlie? The go-to community for practitioners, advocates, and explorers in innovation throughout the island, north and south. And Charlie always does a really good job of emphasizing it's north and south, which in this island is a fairly unusual thing, Joanne. Just, you know, I know you're more Irish than me, but still, just in case.
Well, I wouldn't say that, but pretty Irish from a descendant point of view, yes.
Yeah, and we do have a couple of people who I'm not sure if they would self-declare as Irish, but the core of the group is Irish, and it is the island of Ireland that we're essentially talking to. So today, what are we mainly doing? Today, we're mainly exploring, and we're mainly exploring with this interesting little word, uncertainty. What might that mean? And why on earth would we be so interested in talking about that? And we'd love to hear maybe some of the tips and tricks, what works, what doesn't. How do you go deep to get big impacts from innovation? Why would you go deep to get big impacts from innovation? Surely you don't need to go deep. Why do we need to be thinking about this daft word uncertainty? Right, well, we have with us today my friend and my colleague in ISO circles, Joanne Hyland. Joanne and I first met on the rooftop of a building in Stockholm. I'm not sure if someone was planning to jump off, but it was the middle of a 3-day ISO meeting. So it was in prospect. So Joanne is instrumental now in developing the ISO suite of standards for innovation management. And we work together on developing the new standard, which we've got a DIS out, Claire. The DIS was launched yesterday, Claire. You and I'll be working on that for ISO 56007, which is, what are we calling that, Joanne? Managing?
Guidance for managing ideas and opportunities, I think, is the latest one.
Yeah, the title will change, but the fact is, how do you advise people? What is the distillation of best practice on ideas and opportunities? Not today's focus, but just to give you an idea of the kind of works on. Now, Joanne is the founder and the president of our innovation group that specializes in strategic innovation. Joanne is also very senior in ISPIM, an international society for, what is it? Professional Innovation Management. And we have some good connections through Joanne, Magnus Hochfag and others with that organization, Magnus Carlsen as well. Joanne has also worked in Nortel as a vice president and is the editor of an upcoming book, along with how many others are editing, Joanne? Magnus Carlsen, yourself?
Yeah, there's 5 of us. Yeah, Ingrid Kilhinger, there's Mats Magnuson, John Besant, and Jimmy Norman Christensen.
Very good. So we've got 5 editors of a book upcoming called Changing the Dynamics and Impact of Innovation Management, a Systems Approach and the ISO Standard. So this is not a commercial space. We don't want to be advertising people and what they do in their day job, but I think we need to signpost here that what Joanne's saying is absolutely crucial and fundamental and to the existence of and the design of ISO 56000, ISO 56002 existing, and ISO 56001 upcoming. So we're in at the ground level here, folks. It's a nice place to be. It's a good room to be in. It's a great group looking at who's here today. And Joanne, on that note, I invite you to share your slides and over to you for the next 20 minutes. While Joanne is starting up, folks, just a reminder, today is being recorded. If, as has been said before, if you're not supposed to be here, maybe you don't want to be recorded. But for the rest, the recording will be made available afterwards within the LinkedIn private group. And we do hope there are questions. We will have about 20 minutes of chat with Joanne and then talking led by Joanne, followed by 20 minutes of chat afterwards. Q&A, if you can, put them up on chat. If you want, hold them to afterwards. Use your real hands or the virtual hands, whichever works. We'll try and spot you and make this interactive. Definitely over to you, Joanne.
Okay, I think my slides should be showing the way they should be. Okay, perfect. Thank you, Owen. Okay, so maybe just a little bit more to add to my background. I've been at this for a very, very long time. Before being at Nortel, I worked at Bell Canada, and everywhere I went in my roles, it was always about what I would call a series of firsts. We were always trying to do something new. And as a result, I found my way into innovation or innovation management by starting off in marketing. And when I got to the sort of space of innovation management, and we didn't call it that at the time, It was initially called service development, and then it became more about new business opportunities and so forth. I realized that we could not go about doing this without having a more systematic process for being able to make it happen. And that kind of launched me then on what are, what works and what doesn't work, and what are sort of the keys to being able to get to this. And so when I was thinking about putting this presentation together for today, I'm not going to go into our frameworks, our models. What I really wanted to do is tell a few stories about how the world has evolved and how my insights have evolved over time and how I've learned along the way. And when I say I've been at this for a long time, I'm talking about in the late 80s into the early 90s. So I've been thinking about this. And so we encounter in this world a lot of icebergs. We also encounter a lot of rough seas. And we also experience, I think now, some changing tides that are coming. And a lot of that, as Owen was saying, is around this whole notion of uncertainty. And by the way, we're having a major storm here right now, and we have very rough seas and changing tides, but I haven't seen any icebergs. I think we're a little too far south for that. So first sort of idea here is that most organizations are risk averse. In fact, almost all organizations are risk averse, and they don't even know they're about to hit an iceberg. And they're afraid to step out from what they know of the status quo, and they are actually in a situation where they're at the risk of either not prospering from a business or societal perspective, or actually losing the business completely. And so I was, back in 1994, I was that woman with the red shirt on, sitting around the table. And the story as it goes is that I was at the time the director of new business opportunities within the context of Bell Canada. And every quarter we would meet with the regional Bell operating companies in the US to talk about new business opportunities and what was coming up. And the guy from Pacific Bell at the time, Nick Ciancio, he said, I found this really interesting company that is going to revolutionize the internet. And he said, we've all got to get into this. We've all got to be able to make it happen. We got to take it back to our organizations and so forth. So, of course, we all got very excited about this. And we said, yes, we're working on new business opportunities. The internet was just starting to emerge. And that company happened to be Netscape. And so we knew that Netscape was going to open up access and be able to be the browser into the internet and to be able to obviously open up the internet world. So I went back to my company at the time, and I presented to our board, and I said, look, this is coming, and this is a great opportunity for us, and we should get on it, and we should, and remember, my responsibility was new business opportunities. So we, as a team, we were saying this was a great opportunity for us. And the answer I got from the board at the time is that the only thing the internet would do is potentially displace some of our international toll traffic. And so why would that happen? Well, first of all, our international toll traffic at the time was very expensive. So that's where they thought that we were the most vulnerable. And also we were organized in a way where we had a data division and we had a long distance division. So where does internet fit in all of this? And so as a result of that, we did not pursue it. Eventually, internet service providers emerged and they became separate companies. But I think we all know where the telcos are today. And can you imagine where they would have been if they'd been able to recognize some of these opportunities in their very early days? And at the time, we were looking into things like virtual reality, neural networks, all of the kinds of areas that are now very important to us. So that was a big learning for me. And that actually prompted me to move on to Nortel, because I realized if you don't have the right organization and you don't have the funding to be able to move into some of these new areas, then it's not going to happen. So the next thing is that within the organizations, and this comes from the Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute research, there are obviously these status quo antibodies that are there. Everybody is very comfortable with the status quo, and most of us are not very comfortable with change. And so we don't want to be dealing with a lot of change. Yet, on the other hand, if we want to move into these new areas, we have to deal with change. Change is the constant. It's all about change, and it's all about change management. And so this is another little story about the goose that's able to actually lay these eggs of solid gold. And then you can see the suits come along, and they say that it's a distraction from our core. It's also, we don't have any budget for any of these goose-related expenses. But then on that note, we'll need the feather and the livers for another for another project. And what happens then, obviously, we have no more goose. And everything gets incrementalized. It gets brought down to the lowest common denominator. It gets brought down to what people know rather than what could be possible. And then we lose all of these new business opportunities in the process. And what's typically going on is it's a organization and resource challenges that are really getting in the way of being able to move these very great opportunities forward. And from the RPI research, and that has been going on since 1995, we found that on the uncertainty level, there are actually 4 uncertainties, not 2 uncertainties. Typically, in most organizations or companies, when people would think about radical innovation, they'll think about technical and they'll think about market and more recently mission uncertainty. And what we found is there were 2 other ones, organization and resource, that were actually more problematic. And they were the ones that actually that impeded people or organizations from being able to be successful. So we've spent a lot of time now thinking about how to be systematic in managing or navigating uncertainty, not only in the technical and the market or mission areas, but also on the resource and organization side. So the other part is language. And it was kind of interesting that we started off this conversation about innovation process and that people in the digitization space don't really understand that it's an enabler and so forth. So one of my pet peeves has always been the language of innovation. And I don't know how many of you have heard this, but I've certainly been in circles, especially in the C-suite, where they want the organization to have innovation everywhere. And there's really some unintended consequences of that because, first of all, people don't really know what innovation is. And secondly, you don't really want innovation everywhere. And we've really, tried to, when we're working with companies, create a language so that everybody can be on the same page. And really what we're talking about, and we're going to get to this in a few minutes, is that innovation, and I had to kind of reset on this, if you're thinking about it in ISO terms, it's an outcome. And it's also from the Oslo manual perspective, it has also been defined as an outcome. And what the process is really all about innovation management. And when CEOs ask for innovation, they're actually asking for innovation in certain parts of their business, but it's really they want innovation management in certain parts of their business. And they want the output to be innovation and different types of innovation from incremental to radical or transformational. But no one really has gotten on the same page with respect to the language. And as a result of that, there are a lot of unintended consequences in the process. But as said here, the tides, they are a-changing, and we're starting to see that. And as Owen, introduced this session, and as I'm sure you've heard from Magnus, the 2 Magnuses in the past, there's a lot that's been going on in the ISO world to help with this. So navigating uncertainty is really all about the better outcomes, the better innovation outcomes. And we all have cognitive biases to be right, despite any evidence. A lot of times we think we know something, but we don't really have any evidence to support it. And one of my favorite quotes, and obviously it's not great on grammatical side of things, but it ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so. And there's also a video here that, I'd be happy to share these slides that you can also click on that talks about the Dunning-Kruger effect and the influence of these cognitive biases. And so a lot of what we do about navigating uncertainty is to really surface what we know and what we don't know and what assumptions we're making. And in thinking about the ABCs a number of years ago, I came up with the idea of what's important is to admit what you don't know, to bring structure to chaos, and to also communicate more. And the reason why these are really important is that many of us are not willing to admit what we don't know because we get to where we are based on what we know. But when we get into the world of uncertainty, we have to be willing to admit what we don't know in order to ask the right questions to get the right answers. And then the second one, we've heard a lot of times where the innovation space is really all about serendipity. And there was a big serendipity movement for innovation for many, many years. But if it's only about serendipity, sure, you can, do the ideation, get a lot of great ideas going, but you need to be able to move them forward. And in the absence of a structure to be able to do that, they don't really go anywhere, or they don't achieve the outcomes that we would be hoping for. And then the communicate, and communicate more is because this world is not very familiar to most people. And so we cannot over communicate to help people understand and bring them along. And then we also talk about these, the resource and organization issues actually being the elephants in the rooms. It's often the conversations that we don't have that we need to have in order to be successful. So getting on the same page, and what do we mean by innovation, and what does uncertainty mean to you, and so forth. And I know we're going to come back to this and have a dialogue, but just some things for you to be thinking about right now is, what is your definition of innovation? And I've added in here innovation management, because in my mind, they're two very different terms or terminology or concepts. And does your organization distinguish even between uncertainty and risk, or even types of innovation, from, as you can see here, from incremental to radical or breakthrough or transformational? And is anyone responsible for innovation management in your company, or is it sort of everybody's job and therefore it becomes nobody's job, or in your organization? And I wanted to put forward these three definitions that came from actually the work that has been done in ISO. One is, I know Magnus has already covered sort of what innovation is, and that it is really about being an outcome. But two other areas that we worked with Magnus on was really to distinguish incremental to radical innovation. And so radical innovation or breakthrough innovation, and the two we use synonymously. And the reason we came to that conclusion is that in the English language speaking countries, they prefer the use of breakthrough. And in the non-English speaking countries, they prefer the use of radical. And in the English speaking countries, it's just because radical has another term, radical 60s, radical terrorist organizations, and so forth. So there seems to be, some use of breakthrough that is better accepted in our English speaking world. And what we did is we said that it operates on a continuum with a high degree of change, and incremental innovation is the other end of the continuum. Now, disruptive innovation often gets confused. It gets thrown into the bucket with the incremental to radical or breakthrough innovation spectrum. And disruptive innovation is something that happens to an organization. And it's initially addressing less demanding needs, and then the organizations get disrupted as a result. And we can have disruptive technology happening inside of organizations, but disruptive innovation is actually coming from outside and then influencing what goes on inside. And so we felt it was very important in the ISO circles to also differentiate what is truly disruptive innovation, because a lot of organizations make disruptive innovation synonymous with radical breakthrough or transformational, and it is not. So I have also, just to close, I put together some readings and also wanted to sort of highlight an upcoming innovation management event. And the first reading is really around the standard. Not sure if Magnus Carlsen had mentioned it to you at the time, but it was an article that we wrote explaining what happened when we drafted 56,002, and then Joe Tidd did a critical review, and we sort of commented on Joe Tidd's critical review. So I think it might be an interesting perspective to sort of see what's good about the standard, and also where are the areas for improvement, because that'll be very important for what we're going to be doing for 56,001. And then a few years back, I wrote an article, very brief article, in the Tata Management Journal, and it was really around what's next, strategic innovation. So it kind of gives you a bit of a sense of what strategic innovation is all about. And then probably relevant for most, if not all of you, there's also a great article in the Sloan Management Review about the learning plan. And this really would give you a way of being able to become more systematic about how to navigate through uncertainty. And it's equally relevant. It obviously comes from much larger organizations, but we've also seen the whole model of uncertainty implemented in SMEs, startups, et cetera. So worthwhile if you're interested in learning a little bit more about uncertainty and how to become systematic in managing these 4 uncertainties, that would be a good source for you. And then there's a couple of other articles from Gary Pisano and Safi Bakali that are really good about the cultures and about the innovation equation. Again, more with the eye or the lens of looking at more strategic kind of innovation. And then finally, we have our upcoming, as Owen had mentioned, the ISPIM. I'm on the ISPIM board, and we have an event coming up in Copenhagen, so not very far from Ireland, of course. And so if you're interested, there's a link there where you can look it up, and we would love to have you come and join us as delegates. So that sort of completes my part, and just figure out how to figure out this ending this slideshow. It says swipe forward to exit.
There you go. Masters of Technology. Joanne, that was brilliant and rapid, and well done, because that time management, that's done in a really short period of time. So much appreciated. Covered huge ground in a few minutes. Thanks, Joanne. One thing I would say is, whereas we talked about in terms of the title of today, uncertainty was in there. And one thing we didn't define on the slides was uncertainty. I know why, because you and I talked about the slides, but now's your opportunity to talk about the word uncertainty, because if you don't, I will.
Okay, so I think there's a lot of different schools of thought about what uncertainty really is all about. So this is our school of thought. And when we talk about uncertainty, is basically where the probable outcomes are not known yet. And you really need to go about a learning process in order to be able to reduce uncertainty. Whereas to contrast it with risk is where the probable outcomes are known. So you can sort of write the scenarios and so forth, and you can do the kinds of calculations that are necessary to get to answers. And so if we think about the world of innovation, when you go beyond development or incremental innovation, you move into the world of uncertainty. Whereas if you're in the development world or you're dealing with incremental innovation, you're much more in the world of risk because it's based on what we already know, with variations, of course. Whereas in uncertainty, we don't know yet. And the only way for us to be able to move forward is by learning and going through these cycles of learning to get the right kinds of answers. And so often what happens is people identify these new ideas and opportunities, and they look great on paper, or they look great conceptually in the early days of doing exploration. And then they think that they've got something to move forward with, and they move straight to development, only to find out that they're fraught with uncertainty, and they don't know it until they get there. And then they end up in the development process, and it ends up actually disturbing the development process because you kind of have, apples and oranges or apples and pears together. And what we have is we've introduced sort of what we call an elaborated discovery and an incubation time, where you don't spend a lot of resources, but what the purpose is really to learn more about these opportunities, conceive of them in different ways, test them, incubate them, actually either move forward, stay the course, or you can pivot, you can stop, you can do a lot. And you're really dealing with more of the portfolio options mentality, and you're testing these options before you get to development. And then, when you've gotten to a point where you've reduced uncertainty sufficiently, then you're truly ready for development. So the uncertainty is really happening at the front end of innovation.
Thanks for that, Joanne. And just for people in this room, when you're really bored and you can't sleep at night, or if your name is Claire McBride or Owen Flavin and you have a job of feeding back to the international group, this is the page of the standard 56007 where we have a little working definition of uncertainty and a nice little diagram produced by Joanne Hyland. What an artist.
No, I didn't. No. I drew the conceptual model. Jonathan did the artistic design.
True. Credit where credit is due. Exactly. So here we got for us, for people who aren't necessarily experts in uncertainty, although they might be very experienced in innovation, uncertainty is a lack of knowledge or understanding across a wide range of factors. That's a working definition, operational definition. The one that ends up in the next version of ISO 56000 could be developed somewhat from there. And there is a standard ISO definition of uncertainty we won't go into now. So another thing to highlight for now is this thing is a draft, but I'm just playing with it. Literally, there's coffee stains and all over on this. So by the end of this year, though, we should have ISO 56007, best practice guidance on managing ideas and opportunities. And if it's about anything, it's about navigating uncertainty. And then how do you apply that lens to how do we manage ideas? How do we get them through the thicket, the fuzzy front end? How do we get to the point where we've got things that are really worth developing, that we hand over to more operational teams or individuals or phases, stage gate, whatever the background of that is. So, John, thanks very much for picking up that point for me on the uncertainty specifically. And it was obviously a very Machiavellian design on my part to bring in the fact that we're doing this work on 56007. Ladies and gentlemen, it is time for any questions that people have. And I know that there are a few with hands up already, so I think we better start and run with in order. David, welcome. And you're on mute, David, so you'll need to turn your mic on.
Thank you for the reminder, Owen. It's a pleasure to meet you, Joanne. I'm a bit of a ring-in from Hong Kong. So I'm from an island, but a different island, and so on. I was curious about two elements. I work with a group where we drive a lot of innovation and change based on thinking from Dr. Deming. And so we've gone and operationalized a lot of Deming's thinking and gone and put that into particular methods and tools to be able to drive change. We talk about the idea of rapid learning, building learning organizations through, and I use the term rapid incrementalism. And I'll use the example, say, for example, of the iPhone and so on. There was nothing new in the iPhone. The only thing that was unique was bringing them together in an innovative frame, as it were, together with the iTunes and da. So where does that come within that definition of innovation? And I do have a second question later if there's time.
So with respect to the iPhone, I think it would depend, because the iPhone was really a transformational business model. You know, when the store was brought in to complement it and so forth. So it was really an enabler to something that was much greater. And sometimes business model innovations would kind of fit in the mid-range on the continuum. But given what happened through the iPhone being the enabler to all of that, that was really very transformational because it completely changed the world. So, you know, so we would see that more as on the radical or breakthrough innovation side. And the way we test how, you know, the degree of uncertainty is we ask ourselves, from a technical point of view, is the uncertainty sort of low, medium, or high? From a market or a mission point of view, is it low, medium, or high? From a resource point of view, low, medium, or high? And then from an an organization point of view, low, medium, or high. And if you take Apple, that was a very high organization uncertainty. It was also very high on the resource side. And also from, you know, a market point of view, it was also high. And one could argue that the technical might have been more medium, you know, but even when you have to do integration brings in very, you know, high level of complexity. So you could then argue that also from an uncertainty point of view, that was high. So that's how we sort of say, okay, that fits on the very high end of the spectrum, which makes it more breakthrough, radical, or transformational. Now, the Deming stuff, I think, because you also brought that up, I think when we're talking about opportunities themselves, when we're talking about uncertainty, we're really talking about uncertainty at the opportunity level. We're not talking about it at the overall business or organization kind of risk level. Because anytime you make an investment, it's going to be a risk. And we know when we make an investment, what we're doing, you know, we don't know necessarily what the outcome is going to be at the opportunity level, but we know if we place an investment, then, you know, there's going to be a probable outcome of something happening, either favorable or unfavorable, depending. So when we talk about uncertainty actually operates at the layer of not the system, but at the actual opportunity itself. When you think about, you know, the Deming level and all of that, and the, you know, plan, do, check, act, we need to have at the innovation management system, and I don't want to get into too much detail, but at the innovation management system level, you need to be able to monitor the system. So plan, do, check, act is a very important part of making sure the system is whole and effective and efficient and so forth. So I think when we're talking about, say, an Apple, and its opportunity, whereas when we're talking about Deming and, this, you said, rapid incrementalization?
Yeah.
There's different concepts happening, and I'd be delighted to get into a little more conversation, but then we're going to start getting down into some level of detail that probably is too deep for this conversation. Okay, so thank you, David.
Right. I've got another question for later, though.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Just put your hand back up and we'll come to you in turn. Brilliant. Mr. Tuxworth, surprise, surprise, you're up next.
Yeah, for a change, I have a question to ask. So,
I know.
Joanne, thank you very much for that. Really enjoyed it. And so much of what you were saying resonated and seemed very, very familiar, which is quite comforting from my end, that I seem to be thinking along similar lines. You started to head towards this just as you're wrapping up with David there. But I would do a lot of work with public sector, with financial services, and they have either a very low appetite for risk, or they demand to see return on investment on business cases. So when we're trying to sell the value of innovation, do you have any hints, tips on basically how to be able to communicate the value without being able to necessarily show return on investment, if that makes sense?
Yeah, well, actually, way back when I was vice president at Nortel Networks and we were launching our internal venturing program, I had exactly the same issue as how am I supposed to convince my executive team that it's worthwhile to be making these kinds of investments, because we don't really know what the outcome is going to be. And one thing we also knew at the time is we couldn't put together a credible business case because we had too much uncertainty, and we would end up with compounded assumptions. And as a result of that, it would be very difficult to put something forward that would be credible. And in fact, over the years, we've seen people fired for putting business cases together where they were forced to do it and they knew the numbers were wrong. So we've been giving a lot of thought in the research and in practice about how to go about telling a story in a different way. And it's kind of interesting because Owen and I sort of touched on it when we were making sure my teams would work today, because I think with many of you, we've had some challenges this week. It has to be a strategy conversation. It can't just be about financial return. It has to be about what kind of company do you want to be in the future? What's the health of your core business today or your core organization if you're working in a public sector? What's your mission? What's your purpose? And how do you really hope to get there? And then the next part of the conversation is well, let's start with telling a discovery story. Let's start with how are we going to go about discovering new kinds of opportunities and get into the storytelling mode. And let's, in very small way, experiment. Don't spend a lot of money so that you're not really putting in jeopardy any return on investment in the early days. And, with the idea that when we can reduce the uncertainty, then we can get a better idea of what the return on investment can be. So we actually have to sort of change the story in order to get there. And we have been successful, but it takes time, and it takes a different type of mindset to understand that this is much more about what is possible rather than what is probable at this point in time. And the financial people are all thinking from a probability point of view. And I actually wrote a very brief article for a financial, I can't remember, it was some financial magazine of some sort. And it was exactly that kind of thing. It's like, how do you position this in the world of finance to help people understand that we have uncertainty that we need to deal with first before we can get to the probabilities? And I'd be happy to share that with you if you'd like. So.
Okay, yeah, no, that'd be great. Thank you.
Okay,
thanks for
good.
that. Thank you.
Okay, good.
Joanne, before we dive into the next question, any thoughts on the relative merits of, the burning bridge, we're in the middle of COVID, versus the shining light? Here's an inspiration as framing for those strategy discussions or the incentive for discussions for C-suite or for ops teams when you're trying to communicate the value of this.
Yeah, well, okay, so we actually did a presentation at ISPIM in 2020 about the use of uncertainty and the parallels with COVID. So we told the story from a COVID point of view as to what was going on. And we saw a lot of companies retrench during COVID, going back to more of the operational side of things. keeping, holding down the hatch, so to speak, and waiting to see where things are going to go. But what we're also seeing now is that there's a new wave on the horizon, and the new wave, and I know because Owen was briefing me a little bit, it's the UN, the Sustainable Development Goals. It's the whole area of sustainability that's happening. It's the idea now that organizations are realizing that there could be another pandemic at any point in time, and they weren't ready. Now there's all the supply chain issues that are going on. So organizations are starting to wake up to the reality that they do need to reinvent themselves and find new places to go and grow, and realize now that what took maybe 10 years to change is happening in a year or two. And if you look at what happened with the COVID vaccines, that platform, the mRNA platform, has been around for 10 years. There was just no application for it. And then all of a sudden the application came along, and with huge investment. And next thing you know, we developed a vaccine in unprecedented amount of time. And I think this is making organizations wake up, and that plus the idea that let's face it, we're almost killing our planet, and we've got to do something about it, and we're running out of time. And so there's also a lot of other organizations, because we work with quite a few chemicals companies, and they realize that there's no sustainable future for them unless they become sustainable themselves. So I think COVID has, made people retrench, but now people are really waking up to a new reality.
Okay, Charlie, do you consider yourself answered, or would you like a build on that before we move on?
No, consider myself answered. Very, very good. Again, it's something I've had to deal with. So really just interesting getting Joanne's perspective on that. I did mean to say while I was on mic, so thank you for coming back to me. Joanne, if you click the share button next to the leave button again, that will stop sharing your desktop, so we can see you as you're speaking.
Okay, I click the share. I thought I had said I'd stop sharing. Okay. Is it better?
Yep, that's it there now. That's great.
Okay, good. All right. Okay.
Okay, well, I've got
Sorry
one tiny
about that.
No problem, Joanne, and I hadn't spotted it either. Charlie is our expert Teams jockey, so that's not his only mission in life, but thank you, Charlie. Thanks for being there. Joanne, one final little build, and it's an extension of Charlie's original question. If you're talking about trying to provide arguments that move people, move the needle, engage, and you said stories and discovery, and that harks back to a model that I know you represent, the discover, incubate, accelerate model, which I think is useful phrasing for people to hear. There's also the question of the pre-existing assumptions. So you're going to an organization, their assumption is that their existing business model will continue. So do you find that's good mileage, or do you find that that's a waste of time and you're climbing an even steeper hill if you start challenging their long cherished shibboleths, their coziest assumptions?
Okay, so that's where this learning plan approach really comes into play. Because a lot of times people think that their existing business models are going to be there forever because they're making assumptions that they don't even know they're making. So the learning plan is really set up where we can, in a more objective fashion, challenge those assumptions. And what we do is we get into sessions where we'll actually coach them through, what do you know on the technical side? What do you not know on the technical side? What do you know on the market or the mission side? What do you not know? And then resource and organization, respectively. And for what you know, we put statements. And for what you don't know, we rephrase them as questions. So we're opening up the idea that, I have to start asking some questions. I need to start thinking. And then we start saying, okay, so what are the assumptions that you're making on the basis of these questions that you have? And so then we start to pull out some of these assumptions. And then we say, okay, so on the basis of these questions you're asking, what is most critical for you to learn next? And we ask that in a way where if you don't do it, would it get in the way of your success? And so then we come up with maybe 3 to 5 areas or questions that they need to learn about. And we put together an action plan for them to go about that in terms of, who's going to do it, what's the timeline associated with it, who do they need to speak with, and so forth. And what we find is that most of the time what is most critical is far more on the resource and organization side of things, like clarifying the strategy of the organization. So the business model, for example, the existing business model. Well, maybe we need a new strategy, or maybe we're not clear on what our strategic intent is for the future. So maybe I need to go and talk to somebody about that. Or maybe I don't have the right resources in the role because I've got a lot of people in development that are focused on getting things done and going through the process, but they're not really the right people to be conceptualizing and experimenting. So maybe I need to find some people. And so, that's kind of how we get the conversation going in a non-threatening way to help organizations kind of get out of their own blinders and see what could be possible.
Brilliant. Thanks, Joanne. Now, I'm sorry, Shane, we've made you wait. Sit there with the question waiting to go, but it is your turn.
And see if I can still remember the question at this point. No, thanks, Joanne. This is actually kind of following on from what Charlie was saying. So, if I can roughly summarize some of what you've said, you look at a startup like Netscape, and there's a high tolerance of uncertainty, and they're very innovative. You look at the other end of the spectrum, and you have a mature organization which doesn't respond well to that opportunity because they've spent their whole existence weeding uncertainty out of everything they do and focusing on efficiency. As innovation professionals, I guess a lot of the work that is available to us or that we want to do is helping organizations, big successful organizations with money to spend who have perhaps backed themselves into an efficiency corner to get out of that efficiency corner and become more innovative. But the question I have is there a sort of a minimum tolerance of uncertainty or a sort of innovation heartbeat that has to still be alive? Or is there a point beyond which there just isn't any point? You've efficiencyed yourself to the point where you've plateaued and all you're going to do is cruise and die. And there's no point in trying to come back from that. And we'd all be far better focusing on something that has actually got some innovation life in it. I just wonder what you think of that.
That's a great question. And I think there's two answers to that. The first answer is that yes, in some businesses, like take BASF, for example, very huge business. There's certain parts of their business where they know it's commoditized. They will never have any innovation in it. They're just going to run it out, get the cash that they can, and then eventually close it down. Mm-hmm. There's other parts of their business where they see the potential. They know the possibilities are there, and they're going to be much more invested in innovation as a result. So I think that there is a natural cycle of things at an organization level where businesses will eventually die off, and that's why it's so important to move into other areas. I think the other, though, is an organization's capacity for innovation, because what we see often is that a lot of companies say, or organizations, because we also work with not-for-profit, we work actually with the U.S. Air Force as well, so really different types of organizations, and they say they want to embark on new business opportunities, or they want to get into more innovation types of opportunities, but they don't really have the capacity for it. And in fact, one of the cases, and I'm not trying to promote the book here, but one of the cases in the book, Moen, back in 2007, Professor Gina O'Connor and I, we went in and we did an assessment. And they said that they wanted to get into more strategic innovation. So we went in with that lens. And of course, we were the specialists in breakthrough innovation at the time. So we were looking with that lens. And we interviewed a number of the executives, people working in project roles, et cetera. So we did a pretty good view of what was going on in the organization. And then that night we put together our results and we were presenting to the executive committee the next day. And Gina and I said, do you think these guys even have a capacity for innovation? And we were really asking ourselves if the leadership team could step up. So the next day we presented our results and we said to them, look, we don't think you have the capacity for innovation. You have to be willing to step up as a team. You have to be willing to invest. You have to be willing to move into new areas. You have to be willing to embrace uncertainty, all of these kinds of things. And that in order to be able to do that, you need an innovation management system for it. You need a governance model. You need to manage your more strategic innovation opportunities different from what you do in your development cycles and so forth. So we laid this out on the table and we said, but you know what? If you can't make those kind of commitments, you're wasting our time, you're wasting your money, and we don't want to continue on this journey because we know it will fail. So we basically asked them for a leadership call to action. And it was very interesting. it was not the CEO or the president that stepped up. It was actually the chief financial officer and the chief operating officer. And the chief financial officer said, yeah, we can set up a portfolio of options from a funding point of view, and we can get some money going. And the chief operating officer said, yeah, we can set up a strategy for this, and we can really make it happen. And then they tasked the guy who was in charge of innovation with doing it with the team. And then, we worked with Moen over a course of about 10 years, building the innovation management system, evolving it, and so forth. But I think, that's why, Shane, the question's a good one. You've got to really look at it from an organization in its life cycle perspective and the life cycles within its business areas. And then you also need to look at the leadership team and its ability to embrace innovation, its capacity for it.
All right, Joanne, what I'm going to suggest is Shane's question was brilliant. So actually we could go on that, but poor Claire and David have been waiting. David, is it okay if I go to Claire first? Because you had at least one opportunity already. Thank you. Claire, over to you. 2 minutes, Joanne, 2 minutes.
Thanks very much, Owen, and thank you very much, Joanne. I'm just going to take you back briefly to your publication, actually, and it's a curiosity, which is innovation systems has been with us for so long as a conceptual framework, but the development of corporate innovation systems theory, literature, research has been nascent up to now and seems to have been effectively fired by the ISO standard, which is great to see. Just wondering if you have an opinion on why the corporate world was last to the table in terms of national systems, regional systems, technological systems, sectoral systems.
Yeah, okay, so first, the research from RPI came out in 2008. So we were already designing corporate management systems in the 2001, 2002 era. So, so we've been at this for a very long time. But what we've seen is that most organizations, especially in the US, less so in Europe, but in the US are managed on a quarterly basis. And they're looking at their financial returns, their revenue, et cetera, turnover on and they're really playing to the stock market. And, in the late sort of, around 1995, that's when there was a lot of corporations moving away from the big research labs and really moving into dealing more with the stock market and the stock market returns and so forth. And so, there's a number of us that believe that because there was such a big trend away from collaboration, working with the universities, with the institutions, with the systems, the corporate side of things really lost their way. And I've been reading more recently, and also we've been working with companies where they're realizing that they lost their way, and they're starting to reach out. Now, it's not the big monolith labs that the Bell Labs of the past, but it's still the idea that we need to tap into the outside, and we need to tap into the best minds to be able to make this happen. So I think we're hoping anyway. We're almost like I'm not very religious, but we're praying that. This management system, innovation management system, will really help to get the corporate organizations recognizing it. Now, in Germany, the German companies have been at it for quite a while. So we've seen a good, pace there. And in Denmark, because we've worked there a lot, it's kind of been up and down, but there's a number of them that are also. So we see it in pockets based on our own experience, but it's really, I think, just the way the financial world has been structured that has really been an impediment to organizations being able to move in a more systemic way.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joanne. Great question, Claire. We've chance for one more, and we will have to be pretty quick about it. David.
Yeah, okay. So coming back to the concept of a learning organization, and you talked about that element there, and it kind of relates back to what you were just saying about that quarter-to-quarter sort of focus. So the tendency to be much more operational in order to reduce uncertainty, in order to calculate risk and so on. You've got to be able to learn at an individual team and then organizational and aligned way towards strategy approach. Do you see any great examples of organizations doing that well in America, Asia, or Europe?
Okay, so one company that's been doing it very well is Evonik and their Averse business unit, which is actually, they had a lot of their innovation decentralized. Now they've put it back and centralized it. And they're really focusing on building a learning organization as a result. So, and we have like a direct view into that. IBM was very good at it for many, many years. And then, you know, because they had the emerging business opportunities and they were really building a learning organization as a result of that. So there are a number of organizations out there. I know we're short for time, but like the Googles and the, you know, the Metas, et cetera, that's a completely different model because that's founder driven. And, you know, so I wouldn't put them kind of in the same bucket. But we do see a lot of organizations that have been doing well, but we also see a lot that are not doing well. And it's because they're always pulled down to delivering results rather than understanding that by enabling learning, you get to better results.
Yeah. Thank you.
Joanne, that's brilliant. We're near the end, folks. What I'd just like to draw your attention to is in the chat, I put up some of the links to the articles that Joanne suggested we have a read through. And Joanne, there is one extra article. You said you're going to find a link for us. We'll share that in the conversation next week in the private LinkedIn group. The recording will also be available on the private LinkedIn group, by the way. So Joanne, again, thank you very much. That was super. Really enjoyed that. Loved the chat. Loved the questions. Everybody, thanks for your contributions. I think we're pretty much done for the day. We've stolen your hours and you've got a chance to run for a cup of tea or go to the bathroom before you get back to work. God help you.
I have my cup of tea.
I spotted that beforehand. Well arranged, well organized. Just a couple of points of news. It's small stuff. Next week it's Easter. Enjoy the holiday. We won't be stealing an hour of your day next Friday. The following week, the 22nd, we will have a coffee stop. We don't have an agenda, but you will probably see Charlie's face with the white beard and my face with the pretending, trying to get there. I want to be like Charlie beard, and a few others. We'll be having a coffee, so please do join us. And we've got a series of events upcoming for May, which we'll announce in the week or so after Easter. Other than that, enjoy your weekends, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us. Charlie, any last minute thoughts?
No, just reiterate all of that, and thank you, Joanne. Really enjoyed the session, and it was good to spend time with you. So thank you.
Well done, everybody. See you again.
Good. Yeah.
Thank you,
Delighted
Joanne.
to do it again. And another point.
Take care.
Thanks. Take care.
Thanks.
Have a
Bye-bye.
good weekend. Okay, bye-bye.